Sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most unexpected salvation. When life strips away everything you hold dear, you discover what you're truly willing to sacrifice for survival. Clara Whitmore, a schoolteacher fleeing deadly outlaws, through the frozen Colorado mountains, stumbles upon the cabin of Bear McAllister, the most feared mountain man in 3 territories. With nowhere left to run and death closing in, she drops to her knees and makes him an offer that changes everything. Bear has killed men for less than stepping on his land, but this broken woman's courage touches something he thought was dead. As winter traps them together, dangerous men hunt them, and 2 wounded souls must decide if trust is worth the risk. Can love bloom in the harshest wilderness when survival demands everything you have? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air cut like broken glass through Clara Whitmore's lungs as she pressed forward through the deep snow. Each breath came in painful gasps, her Boston-made boots sliding treacherously on the icy slope. Her dark wool traveling dress, once proper for teaching school children in Denver, now hung in tatters, the fabric torn by thorns and branches during her desperate flight. The blood-stained teaching certificate tucked inside her bodice served as a cruel reminder of the life she'd lost. The neat classroom with its rows of eager faces, the satisfaction of watching young minds bloom under her careful guidance. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now, though barely a week had passed since she'd witnessed the murder that changed everything. Miles below, Bear McAllister stood at the edge of his cabin's porch, his weathered hands gripping his father's old hunting rifle. At 42, he carried himself with the purposeful economy of a man who'd learned that wasted motion could mean death. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung past his shoulders in a way that would have scandalized the military officers who'd once saluted him. The thick beard couldn't quite hide the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a memento from a Cheyenne war party that had caught him scouting alone near Fort Collins. The rifle had belonged to his father, Jeremiah McAllister, a man who'd carved out a living in these mountains before the war between the states had torn the country apart. Bear's fingers traced the worn stock automatically, finding the small carved initials his father had pressed into the wood during long winter evenings. That rifle had fed the family, protected them from wolves and worse, and now it served as Bear's constant companion in his self-imposed exile. He'd built his cabin in a spot his father would have approved of, backed against a sheer rock face that no enemy could scale, overlooking a valley that offered clear sightlines in 3 directions. The 4th direction led deeper into the mountains, along paths only Bear knew, where a man could disappear forever if needed. He'd learned the value of such knowledge during his years as a Union Army scout, before shame and betrayal had driven him to this lonely peak. The winter of 1876 had come early and harsh, coating the Colorado Territory in a blanket of snow that would last until April. Most sensible folks had retreated to the relative warmth of towns like Boulder or Golden, but Bear preferred the isolation. Up here, no one asked questions about his past. No one looked at him with the mixture of fear and disgust he'd grown accustomed to seeing in civilized eyes. His daily routine had become as fixed as the mountain itself. Rise before dawn. Check. The trap lines that provided most of his meat. Chop firewood to keep the cabin warm through the bitter nights. Read from one of the 23 books he'd salvaged from his former life, mostly military histories and philosophy texts that helped pass the endless hours. Write in his journal, documenting weather patterns and wildlife movements with the methodical precision of his military training. The solitude suited him. It had to, because he'd burned every bridge back to the world of men. Down in the valley, trouble rode under the name of Jebediah Kane. The outlaw leader sat his horse with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met consequences for his actions. At 35, Kane had built a reputation for cruelty that stretched from the Kansas border to the California goldfields. His gang of 6 men followed him not out of loyalty, but from fear and the promise of easy money. They'd been tracking the schoolteacher for 5 days now, following her desperate path up into the high country. Kane fingered the federal warrant in his coat pocket, $500 for Clara Whitmore, dead or alive. The federal marshal she'd seen him kill had been carrying important documents, and Kane couldn't afford to let any witnesses live to testify about what she'd observed. "She's heading up toward the old mining claims," said Pete Donovan, Kane's second in command. A thin man with nervous eyes, Donovan had been riding with outlaws since he'd deserted from the Confederate Army near End. "Ain't nothing up there but rocks and wolves." Kane studied the tracks in the snow with practiced eyes. The woman's boots made distinctive marks, city-made soles with no business in mountain terrain. She was leaving an easy trail to follow, which meant she was either stupid or desperate. Based on what he'd learned about Clara Whitmore, he suspected it was desperation driving her forward. "There's that mountain man supposed to live up there," offered Jimmy Cox, the youngest member of the gang. At 19, Cox still had the eager stupidity that got men killed in this business. "Bear McAllister. Heard tell he's meaner than a rattlesnake and twice as deadly." Kane spat into the snow. He'd heard the stories too. How Bear McAllister had once tracked a war party for 2 weeks through hostile territory. How he could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 100 yards. How he'd killed 3 men in Boulder with nothing but a knife and his bare hands. Stories grew in the telling, especially when they involved men who'd disappeared into the wilderness. "Mountain man or not, he's just one man," Kane said, "and we got business to finish." Up at the cabin, Bear felt the familiar tingle between his shoulder blades that had kept him alive through 10 years of frontier warfare. Something was moving in his territory, something that didn't belong. He stepped back into the cabin's shadows, eyes scanning the tree line below for any sign of movement. The cabin itself reflected its owner's practical nature. A single room with thick log walls chinked against the cold, a stone fireplace that drew properly and threw heat into every corner. Bear had built everything himself. The rough-hewn furniture, the sleeping alcove with its pile of furs and blankets, the storage areas where he kept his supplies. A few personal items hinted at his past. A battered copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a compass in a silver case, and a medal wrapped in oilcloth that he never looked at anymore. The Medal of Honor had been presented to him by General Sherman himself for actions during a scouting mission behind Confederate lines. Bear had saved the lives of 2 companies by bringing back intelligence about an enemy ambush, but he'd also watched those same companies slaughter civilians 3 days later on orders from their commanding officer. When he'd refused to participate and spoke out against the massacre, his heroism had been quickly forgotten. Court-martialed for insubordination and cowardice, stripped of rank and drummed out of the service, Bear had discovered that heroism was only valued when it served the right political purposes. The West offered sanctuary for men like him, those whose consciences had made them inconvenient to the authorities. But Clara Whitmore knew nothing of these complications as she struggled through the snow above his cabin. All she knew was that her lungs burned with each breath. Her legs trembled from exhaustion, and the sound of pursuing hoofbeats had faded behind her only because the terrain had grown too treacherous for horses. The federal marshal's blood had been warm on her hands as he'd pressed a small leather portfolio into her grasp. "Get this to Denver," he'd whispered with his dying breath. "Don't let them—" A bullet from Kane's gun had ended his words forever, but Clara understood the message. Whatever was in that portfolio was worth killing for, which meant it was worth dying to protect. She'd run because staying meant certain death. Now, as night fell over the frozen peaks and the temperature plummeted toward deadly cold, she began to wonder if running had simply chosen a different kind of death. The portfolio was still tucked against her ribs, under the layers of torn fabric and growing despair. She didn't know what documents the marshal had been carrying, but she understood they represented her only hope of justice for his murder. If she could survive long enough to reach civilization, maybe the truth could still matter. But survival seemed increasingly unlikely as she spotted the warm glow of lamplight through the trees ahead. A cabin meant people, and people meant either salvation or a different kind of danger. In her experience, strangers in the wilderness rarely offered help without expecting something in return. Still, the alternative was freezing to death alone. In the snow, Clara squared her shoulders and forced her exhausted legs to carry her toward the light, unaware that she was walking into the territory of the most dangerous man in 3 territories, and perhaps, though she couldn't know it yet, toward the salvation she'd prayed for but never expected to find. Clara's legs finally betrayed her 20 yards from the cabin's front porch. The exhaustion that had been building for days crashed over her like an avalanche, and she collapsed face first into the snow. The cold bit through her torn dress immediately, but she lacked the strength to push herself upright. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with frostbite, fumbled for the small locket she wore around her neck, the only thing she had left of her family. Inside the silver oval was a daguerreotype of her parents and younger brother, taken 3 years ago, in Boston before consumption had claimed them all. She'd come west to start over, to build a new life teaching children in Denver. Now she pressed the locket to her lips and whispered a prayer to their memory, certain she was about to join them. The cabin door slammed open with a bang that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Bear McAllister emerged with his rifle already shouldered, the barrel trained on the figure sprawled in his yard. His eyes swept the tree line for signs of an ambush, every instinct screaming that this was a trap. Nobody stumbled onto his land. By accident, the paths were too treacherous, the location too remote. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Clara managed to lift her head enough to see the massive figure silhouetted against the warm lamplight. Bear McAllister was everything the stories claimed, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His dark hair hung loose around a face carved from granite, and the rifle in his hands was held with the steady competence of a born killer. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not armed. I'm just a coughing." Fit seized her, and she tasted blood on her lips. Bear's finger tightened on the trigger. Too many good men had died because they'd shown mercy to the wrong person at the wrong time. But something about the woman's voice gave him pause. It carried the refined accent of education, not the rough drawl of frontier criminals. "Who are you?" he demanded, taking a step closer while keeping the rifle trained on her. "What are you doing on my land?" Clara tried to push herself up to her knees, but her arms shook too badly to support her weight. The effort sent waves of pain through her frozen limbs. She could see death in the mountain man's eyes, could feel his finger on the trigger. Desperation made her bold. "Clara Whitmore," she managed to say. "Schoolteacher from Denver. Please, I know what this looks like, but I swear I mean you no harm." Bear's eyes narrowed. A schoolteacher, alone in the wilderness in the dead of winter. Either she was lying or something very bad had driven her up here. Neither possibility inclined him toward mercy. "School teachers don't travel alone through mountain passes in winter," he said. "Try again." The cold was seeping through Clara's dress, through her skin, into her very bones. She could feel consciousness slipping away, but she forced herself to focus on the man with the gun. If she was going to die, at least she could die with dignity intact. "There are men hunting me," she said, the words coming out in visible puffs of vapor. "Outlaws. They killed a federal marshal, and I was the only witness." She struggled to her knees, swaying dangerously. "I've been running for days. I didn't know this was your land. I just saw the light and—" Bear cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Stand up slowly." Clara tried to comply, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She managed to rise halfway before toppling forward again. This time she landed hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. When she looked up, Bear had moved closer. close enough that she could see the scar on his face, the grim set of his mouth. This was it, then. This was how Clara Whitmore would die, frozen and alone, murdered by a man whose name children used to frighten each other. At least it would be quick. Instead of pulling the trigger, Bear found himself studying the woman more carefully. Her dress was quality fabric, now ruined by days of hard travel. Her hands, though dirty and scratched, had the soft paleness of someone who worked with books instead of tools. Most telling were her eyes, wide with fear, but holding a core of stubborn courage that reminded him of the young soldiers he'd led into battle. "You said men are hunting you," he said. "How many?" Clara blinked, surprised to still be alive. 6, maybe 7, led by a man named Jebediah Kane. She saw Bear's expression darken at the name. "You know him?" Bear knew him by reputation. Kane was the kind of outlaw who gave decent criminals a bad name. Vicious, unpredictable, and smart enough to avoid the law for years. If Kane was hunting this woman, she was as good as dead unless someone intervened. "Get up," Bear commanded again. "I can't," Clara whispered. "My legs." "Then crawl." The cruelty in his voice made Clara's eyes flash with anger. Even facing death, her pride rebelled against such treatment. She lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "I won't crawl for any man," she said. "If you're going to kill me, at least have the decency to do it while I'm trying to stand." Bear felt something unexpected stir in his chest, respect for this broken woman's defiance. He'd seen grown men beg and grovel when facing death, but this schoolteacher was ready to die on her feet rather than compromise her dignity. Almost against his will, he found himself lowering the rifle slightly. "I said men are hunting you," he repeated. "Why should I believe that's true?" Clara's hand moved instinctively to the portfolio hidden beneath her dress, then stopped. She couldn't tell this stranger about the documents. Too much depended on them reaching the right hands. But maybe she could offer him something else, something that might buy her life. "Because I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "Because I'm going to freeze to death in the next hour, whether you shoot me or not." She swayed on her knees, fighting to stay conscious. "And because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to survive." The last words came out barely above a whisper, but they hit Bear like a physical blow. He saw something in her eyes then, not just fear or desperation, but a kind of terrible resolve. This woman had already lost everything that mattered to her. What was left was pure survival instinct. "What are you offering?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why he was prolonging this conversation. Clara took a shuddering breath, knowing that her next words would either save her life or damn her soul. But with her family's locket cold against her throat and death closing in from all sides, she found she was willing to bargain with the devil himself. "Don't kill me, mountain man," she pleaded, her voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation. "I'll warm your bed." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. Bear stared down at the woman kneeling in his yard, trying to process what she'd just offered. In all his years of isolation, no woman had ever made such a proposition. The crude saloon girls in the mining towns sold their bodies for gold, but this was different. This was a desperate bargain, struck by someone who understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing everything else. "You don't know what you're saying," he said finally. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Clara's voice grew stronger, fueled by the fierce determination that had carried her through days of running. "I'm educated. I can cook, clean, tend wounds. I won't be dead weight." She paused, then added quietly, "And I'll share your bed willingly if that's what it takes to live." Bear felt his world shift on its axis. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that he needed no one, wanted no one. His exile was complete and permanent, but this woman's offer touched something deep inside him that he'd thought was frozen beyond. "Redemption. The men hunting you," he said slowly. "They'll come here, probably. And you're willing to bring that danger to my door?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "Mister, danger is already at your door." I'm just asking you to let me face it beside you instead of alone. Bear studied her for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed to lead to trouble. Finally, he made a decision that surprised even him. "Get inside," he said, lowering his rifle completely. "Before you freeze to death and make my choice for me." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You're not going to kill me?" "Not today," Bear replied. "But that could change if you give me reason to regret this." He stepped forward, and without asking permission, swept Clara up into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. As he carried her toward the cabin, she pressed her face against his chest and whispered words he almost didn't catch. "Thank you." Bear said nothing in reply, but his arms tightened around her slightly as he carried her across the threshold into warmth and relative safety. Behind them, the wind covered their tracks, but it couldn't erase the fact that Clara Whitmore had just changed both their lives forever. Clara's first sensation upon waking was warmth, blessed, life-giving warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. She lay still for several moments, afraid that opening her eyes might shatter this dream and return her to the frozen nightmare of the past week. But the crackle of a wood fire and the scent of coffee brewing convinced her that she was indeed alive and, for the moment, safe. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished but surprisingly clean. She lay on a narrow cot near the fireplace, covered with thick furs that smelled of wood smoke and pine. Across the room, Bear McAllister sat at a rough-hewn table, moving carved wooden pieces across a checkered board with the deliberate concentration of a chess master. The chess set was clearly handmade, each piece carved with meticulous detail, from different types of wood. The king was fashioned from dark walnut, while the queen was pale birch, and the knights bore intricate manes that spoke of countless hours of patient work. Clara realized this wasn't just a game to pass time. It was the creation of a man who needed to keep his mind sharp during the long winter months. "You're awake," Bear said, without looking up from his game. "There's coffee in the pot and biscuits by the fire. You'll need food to get your strength back." Clara struggled to sit up, wincing as her muscles protested. She was still wearing her torn dress, but someone had removed her ruined boots and stockings. Her feet were wrapped in clean bandages, and she could feel the sting of frostbite beginning to heal. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion, "for everything. I thought I was going to die out there." Bear moved a wooden bishop 3 squares diagonal, studying the board as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Day's not over yet. Men like Cain don't give up easy." The reminder of her pursuers sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the weather. She forced herself to stand, swaying slightly as her legs remembered how to support her weight. The portfolio containing the marshal's documents was still hidden beneath her dress, a small comfort in an uncertain situation. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked, making her way carefully to the coffee pot. 6 hours. Sun's getting low again." Bear finally looked up from his chess game, his dark eyes studying her with the same intensity he'd brought to the wooden pieces. "You talk in your sleep. Mentioned Boston, a brother named Thomas." Clara's hand tightened on the coffee cup, pain flashing across her features. "Thomas died last spring. Consumption, like our parents. I came west to start over, to put the grief behind me." She took a sip of the strong coffee, grateful for its warmth. "Seems like bad luck follows me wherever I go." "Luck's got nothing to do with it," Bear said. "You saw something you shouldn't have seen. That makes you a target until someone deals with the problem." "And what would you know about being a target?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the sharp tone. This man had saved her life. She had no right to challenge him. Bear's smile held no warmth. "More than you might think." He stood and moved to the window, peering out at the approaching dusk. His movements were fluid and careful, like a predator constantly aware of potential threats. Clara found herself studying the breadth of his shoulders, the way his dark hair fell across the scar on his face. "Those old wounds on your back," she said quietly. They weren't made by animals. Bear turned sharply, and Clara realized she'd revealed more knowledge than was wise. You examined me while I was unconscious. Your shirt was torn from the cold. I saw the scars. Clara met his gaze steadily. Bullet wounds, I'd guess, and fairly recent ones. You seem to know a lot about gunshot wounds for a schoolteacher. My father was a doctor in Boston. I helped him tend patients when I was young. Clara set down her coffee cup and crossed to where he stood. Those wounds were infected recently. They need proper cleaning. They're fine. They're not fine. Clara's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in matters of health and safety. Infection kills more men out here than bullets do. Let me help. Bear stared at her for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of allowing this stranger such intimate access. But the wounds had been bothering him more than he cared to admit, and it had been years since anyone had offered to tend them with skill rather than crude frontier medicine. The water basin is by the stove, he said finally. There's soap and clean cloth in the cabinet. Clara worked with practiced efficiency, heating water and gathering supplies. When Bear reluctantly removed his shirt, she examined the scars with the dispassionate eye of someone trained in medical matters. 3 bullet wounds marked his back, 2 that had healed cleanly, and 1 that still showed signs of recent inflammation. This one's been giving you trouble, she said, gently probing the area around the infected wound. When did this happen? 2 months ago. Bolder. Bear's voice was tight with barely controlled pain. 3 men thought they could collect the bounty on my head. They were wrong. Clara began cleaning the wound with practiced movements, her touch gentle but firm. There's a bounty on you? $500 last I heard, same as what Kane's probably carrying for you. The knowledge that she and Bear were both marked for death created an odd sense of kinship. Clara found herself relaxing as she worked, falling into the familiar rhythm of tending injuries. Her fingers moved confidently over Bear's scarred skin, cleaning away the infection and applying fresh bandages. You have good hands, Bear said quietly. Steady. Thomas used to say the same thing. He wanted me to study medicine formally, but Harvard doesn't accept women in their medical program. Clara's voice carried old disappointment. Teaching was the only respectable profession open to me. Respectability's overrated, Bear replied. Staying alive matters more. As Clara finished tending his wounds, Bear found himself relaxing under her touch in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Her hands were gentle but competent, and she worked without the squeamishness he'd expected from a city-bred woman. There was steel beneath her refined exterior, a strength that matched his own. Why are you helping me? Clara asked as she secured the final bandage. Most men would have taken what I offered and thrown me out to freeze. Bear pulled his shirt back on, considering her question. Maybe I'm not most men. No, Clara agreed, studying his face in the firelight. You're not. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and reminding them both that winter held dominion over these mountains. Clara moved to help Bear with his chess game, surprised to discover that the wooden pieces were arranged in a complex problem requiring several moves to reach checkmate. You made this set yourself, she said, picking up the carved queen and admiring its delicate features. Long winters, Bear replied. A man needs something to keep his mind sharp. Clara studied the board position with growing appreciation. This is a famous problem, from a game between Morphy and the Duke of Brunswick, if I'm not mistaken. Bear's eyebrows rose in surprise. You know chess? My father taught me. He said it was good exercise for the mind. Clara moved one of the pieces, solving the puzzle in 3 moves. He also said it was a useful skill for reading character. And what does my chess set tell you about my character? Clara smiled for the first time since entering his cabin. That you're far more educated than you pretend to be, that you have patience and attention to detail, and that you're probably very good at thinking several moves ahead. Bear felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd carried for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen intelligence rather than just a dangerous animal? We should eat, he said, moving to the stove where a pot of venison stew had been simmering. And then we need to talk about what happens next. As they shared the simple meal, Clara found herself studying Bear's movements. Everything he did was economical and precise, from the way he ladled the stew to how he positioned himself to watch, both the door and window simultaneously. This was a man who'd learned to survive by thinking constantly about threats and opportunities. "The men hunting you," Bear said between bites. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Clara set down her spoon, appetite suddenly gone. "It was 3 days outside Denver. I was traveling to take a teaching position in Boulder when our stage was attacked. The other passengers scattered, but I hid behind some rocks and watched." She closed her eyes, seeing again the scene that had changed her life. "There was a federal marshal traveling with us, Marshal Henderson. Kane's men surrounded him, demanded he hand over some kind of documents." "What kind of documents?" "I don't know, but they were important enough that Marshal Henderson died rather than give them up." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Kane shot him in cold blood, then searched his body. That's when he saw me watching." Bear absorbed this information with the analytical mind of a former military scout. Federal documents important enough to kill for that suggested connections beyond simple outlawry. Kane was ambitious and smart enough to know that certain kinds of information were more valuable than gold. "How many shots did you hear when the stage was attacked?" he asked. Clara frowned, trying to remember. "Maybe a dozen. The passengers scattered quickly." "And how many other passengers were there?" "4, besides myself and the marshal." Bear did quick calculations. If Kane's gang had fired a dozen shots at 6 people and only killed the marshal, they were either poor marksmen or they'd been specifically targeting Henderson. Given Kane's reputation for efficiency, Bear suspected the latter. This wasn't a random stage robbery, he concluded. They were after those documents specifically. Clara nodded miserably. "I think you're right, which means they'll never stop hunting me as long as I'm alive to testify about what I saw." Bear studied her face in the firelight, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. This woman had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple murder. If federal documents were involved, there might be corruption. Reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, you can't run forever, he said quietly. "I know." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "But I don't know what else to do. Who can I trust? How do I know that anyone in authority isn't part of whatever conspiracy got Marshal Henderson killed?" Bear found himself admiring her courage, even as he recognized the impossible position she was in. A lone woman with dangerous knowledge, no allies, and nowhere to turn for help. In another life, he might have told her to find the nearest army. Post and trust in military justice. But Bear McAllister no longer trusted in military justice, or any other kind of justice for that matter. "For now, you stay here," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out how to keep you alive long enough to matter." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness in his voice. "Why are you willing to help me? You don't even know me." Bear looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just the refined schoolteacher, but the steel core that had carried her through days of desperate flight. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be hunted for something that wasn't your fault." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the frozen peaks like a warning. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and unexpected companionship, Clara Whitmore began to believe that she might actually survive to see another dawn. The blizzard struck just before midnight, transforming the world outside the cabin into a howling, white void. Clara woke to the sound of wind battering the walls with the fury of a living thing, driving snow through every gap in the chinking. She pulled the fur covers closer around her shoulders and listened to Bear moving about the cabin, checking the fire and securing anything that might be blown away. "How bad is it?" she asked softly. "Bad enough," Bear replied, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This'll last at least 2 days, maybe 3. Nobody's traveling in weather like this." Clara felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The storm would protect them from Kane's pursuit, but it also trapped them together in increasingly intimate circumstances. She was acutely aware of Bear's presence in the small space, the way he moved with predatory grace, the subtle scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes. As dawn broke grey and muted through the storm, they settled into an enforced domesticity that felt both natural and dangerous. Clara took over the cooking duties, discovering that Bear's supplies were well organized and adequate for a long siege. She made coffee and flapjacks while he tended the fire and checked his weapons, with the methodical care of a professional soldier. "Tell me about your family," Bear said as they ate breakfast. "The brother you mentioned." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to the locket at her throat. Hidden beneath her bodice was the small derringer she'd sewn into the dress lining before. Fleeing Denver, a precaution that had seemed foolish at the time, but now felt prescient. Thomas was 2 years younger than me, but he acted like the older brother, always trying to protect me from the world's harsh realities. What would he think of your current situation? He'd be horrified, Clara admitted with a sad smile. Thomas believed in propriety above all else. He wanted me to marry a respectable Boston merchant and raise proper children. The idea of me offering to— She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. To warm a mountain man's bed? Bear finished, his tone neutral. It would have scandalized him. Clara met Bear's eyes directly, but Thomas never had to choose between his virtue and his life. I suspect his principles might have been more flexible if he'd faced what I'm facing. Bear studied her over his coffee cup, impressed by her honesty. Most people tried to justify their desperate choices, but Clara simply acknowledged them as necessities. "Do you regret making that offer?" Clara considered the question seriously. "No. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, but not the choice itself. I'm alive because I was willing to do whatever survival required, even if I'd taken you up on it. Especially then." Clara's voice was steady, matter of fact. "I've seen what men do to women when they have no power to resist. At least my offer gave me some control over the terms." Bear felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of respect and protectiveness that he hadn't experienced in years. This woman understood the brutal mathematics of survival without losing her essential dignity. She was stronger than most men. He'd known. "You mentioned you could shoot," he said, changing the subject. "Show me." Clara retrieved the small derringer from its hiding place, handling the weapon with competent familiarity. Bear examined it with professional interest. A .41 caliber single-shot pistol, well-maintained and clearly functional. "My father insisted I learn," Clara explained. "He said a woman traveling alone needed protection, especially in the territories. I'm not a marksman, but I can hit what I aim at within 20 feet. That's closer than most fights happen anyway," Bear said, handing the gun back. "Keep it loaded and within reach. Men like Kane don't give warnings before they attack." The storm continued through the day, trapping them in an intimacy that grew more comfortable with each passing hour. Clara discovered that Bear was surprisingly well-read, with opinions on everything from Shakespeare to military strategy. His bookshelf contained works by Marcus Aurelius, Sun Tzu, and Edgar Allan Poe, eclectic choices that revealed a hungry intellect. "Most people assume mountain men are barely civilized," Clara observed as they discussed Poe's poetry. "You're more educated than half the men I knew in Boston." "Education doesn't require formal schooling," Bear replied. "Just curiosity and time to think. I've had plenty of both up here." "Is that why you chose this isolation? To think?" Bear's expression darkened. "I chose it because civilized society made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore." Clara sensed painful history behind those words, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she found herself sharing stories of her own past, her work teaching immigrant children in Denver, her frustration with society's limitations on women, her dreams of starting a school where girls could learn subjects beyond domestic arts. "You could do that here," Bear said quietly. "There are families scattered through these mountains, children who've never seen the inside of a schoolhouse." After this is over, you mean, assuming I survive? You'll survive, Bear said with quiet conviction, one way or another. As evening fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. Clara made supper while Bear worked on maintaining his weapons, cleaning rifle barrels, sharpening knives, checking ammunition supplies. His movements were efficient and practiced, those of a man who'd learned that properly maintained equipment could mean the difference between life and death. You were a soldier, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Bear's hands paused in their work. What makes you say that? The way you handle weapons, the way you think about threats and defensive positions. My father treated Union soldiers during the war. I recognize the habits. Union Army Scout, Bear confirmed after a moment. 10th. Mountain Infantry, attached to various cavalry units as needed. What happened? Bear was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he set down his cleaning cloth and met her eyes. I found out that being right about something doesn't matter if the wrong people are making the decisions, he said. Sometimes doing your duty means watching innocent people die because some politician decided their lives were expendable. Clara heard the pain beneath his carefully controlled words. You tried to stop something terrible from happening. I tried. Failed. Got branded a coward and a traitor for my trouble. Bear's smile was bitter. Turns out heroism is only valued when it serves the right political purposes. That's why you came here, to hide. To survive, Bear corrected. There's a difference. Clara moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. I'm sorry. I can't imagine how it must feel to have your service discredited by the very people you tried to protect. It taught me not to trust in other people's definitions of honor, Bear said. Now I decide for myself what's worth fighting for, and what have you decided? Bear looked at her for a long moment, seeing the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes, the way her hair had come loose from its pins to frame her face. I'm still figuring that out. The wind rattled the windows again, reminding them of the storm's fury. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to check the fire. As she bent to add wood to the flames, Bear found himself watching. The graceful line of her neck, the competent way she handled the domestic task. Your nightmares, he said quietly. You cry out sometimes. Always the same name, Thomas. Clara straightened, her face shadowed with old grief. I dream about the day he died. He was so young, barely 23. The consumption took him slowly, and there was nothing I could do to help. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I keep thinking I should have done more, tried harder to save him. Some things can't be saved, Bear said gently, no matter how much you want to fix them. Is that what you tell yourself about whatever happened during the war? Bear was quiet for a moment, surprised by her perceptiveness. Every day. Clara moved to sit beside him on the rough-hewn bench, careful to maintain a respectable distance while still offering comfort. Maybe we're both carrying guilt that isn't ours to bear? Maybe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Clara found herself studying Bear's profile in the firelight, the strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the scar that spoke of violence survived. He was nothing like the refined Boston gentleman she'd known, yet there was something fundamentally decent about him that spoke to her heart. When this is over, she said softly, when Cain and his men are dealt with, what will you do? Keep living, I suppose. Same as always. Alone. Bear turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. You offering an alternative? Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I don't know, maybe, if you'd want... She stopped, suddenly uncertain. I'm sorry, I shouldn't presume. Clara. Bear's voice was rougher than usual. Look at me. She met his eyes, seeing something there that made her breath catch. For a moment, the space between them seemed charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. You don't owe me anything, Bear said quietly. What you offered before, that was desperation talking. You don't have to honor it. I know, Clara replied, but what if I wanted to anyway? Not out of desperation, but because... She struggled. to find words for feelings she'd never expected to have. "Because I've never met anyone like you." Bear reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "You deserve better than a disgraced soldier hiding in the mountains. Don't I get to decide what I deserve?" Before Bear could answer, a sound outside made them both freeze, the distant whinny of a horse, barely audible over the storm. Bear was on his feet instantly, rifle in his hands, all traces of tenderness replaced by deadly alertness. "Get away from the windows," he commanded quietly. "Stay low and keep that derringer ready." Clara's heart hammered as she obeyed, the intimate moment shattered by the reminder that death was never far away in this harsh land. As Bear moved to peer out into the storm, she pressed her back against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. The blizzard that had seemed like protection now felt like a trap, hiding approaching enemies until they were almost at the door. Whatever was coming for them in the white darkness, Clara knew their fragile peace was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. The sound proved to be a false alarm. A lone elk seeking shelter from the storm, its call distorted by the wind into something that had sounded like a horse's whinny. But the moment of terror served to remind both Clara and Bear how precarious their situation remained. Even as they settled back into the cabin's warmth, the knowledge that death could arrive without warning colored every interaction. Over the following days, as the blizzard gradually spent its fury, they developed routines that felt almost matrimonial in their comfortable domesticity. Clara woke before dawn to start coffee and prepare breakfast, while Bear checked the trap lines and gathered firewood. She mended his shirts with neat, precise stitches, and he taught her to read the mountain weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death. "See how the clouds stack up against the western peaks," Bear said as they stood on the cabin's small porch, watching the storm finally begin to clear. "That means we'll have at least 2 days of clear weather before the next system moves in." Clara studied the sky with the intensity of a student determined to master a difficult lesson. "How can you tell the difference between 2 days and 3? Experience. And this." Bear pulled a leather-bound journal from his coat pocket, its pages filled with meticulous observations recorded in a neat, precise hand. "I've been tracking weather patterns up here for 3 years. Wind direction, cloud formations, temperature changes, all of it matters when you're trying to predict what's coming." Clara examined the journal with growing appreciation for its thoroughness. Each entry was dated and detailed, with small sketches of cloud formations and notes about animal behavior. It was the work of a methodical mind, someone who understood that knowledge could be the difference between survival and death. "You're a natural scientist," she said with admiration. "This is better organized than most of the academic papers I've read." Bear felt an unexpected flush of pride at her approval. It had been years since anyone had looked at his work and seen intelligence rather than eccentricity. "Books can only teach you so much. The mountains have their own lessons." "Teach me," Clara said simply. "I want to learn everything you know." Over the next day, Bear found himself sharing knowledge he'd never thought to pass on to another person. He showed Clara how to read animal tracks in snow, how to identify the subtle signs that indicated dangerous shifts in weather, how to move through the forest without leaving obvious traces of passage. Clara proved an eager and capable student. Her educated mind grasped concepts quickly, and her teaching experience made her ask the kind of probing questions that forced Bear to examine his own assumptions. When she helped him check the trap lines, her steady hands and lack of squeamishness impressed him. "You're not what I expected when you first collapsed in my yard," he admitted as they walked back to the cabin through the crisp morning air. "What did you expect? A helpless city woman who'd be more burden than asset, someone who'd need constant protection and couldn't contribute anything useful." Clara smiled, adjusting the pack of supplies she'd insisted on carrying. "And now? Now, I think Thomas would be proud of how strong his sister turned out to be." The casual reference to her brother brought tears to Clara's eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. He always said I was tougher than I looked. I never believed him until I had to prove it. Strength isn't something you have, or don't have, Bear said thoughtfully. It's something you develop when circumstances require it. You've been developing yours since the day those outlaws started hunting you. As they approached the cabin, Clara found herself studying Bear's face in the clear mountain light. The harsh angles and weathered skin told stories of violence and hardship, but there was kindness in his dark eyes when he looked at her. This dangerous man had become her protector, her teacher, and increasingly, the focus of feelings she'd never expected to have for anyone. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner, Clara finally voiced the question that had been troubling her for days. When this is over, when Cain and his men are dealt with, what happens to us? Bear set down his coffee cup, studying her face in the firelight. What do you want to happen? I don't know, Clara admitted. A week ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm beginning to hope there might be a future worth planning for. She hesitated, then continued more boldly. But I don't want to build that future alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Bear found himself thinking about the 3 years he'd spent in self-imposed exile, convinced that he needed no one and wanted no one. Clara's presence had changed something fundamental in him, had awakened a longing for companionship that he'd thought was dead. I'm not an easy man to live with, he said finally. This place is harsh, isolated. There are no tea parties or literary societies, no opera or theatre, just mountains and weather, and the constant need to stay alert for danger. Do you think I care about tea parties? Clara asked softly. I found more intellectual stimulation in your company over the past few days than I had in months of Denver society. I'd rather discuss philosophy with you by firelight than attend a dozen fancy social gatherings. Bear felt his defenses crumbling under the sincerity in her voice. You say that now, but winter here is long and hard. By February, you might be ready to walk back to Denver through 10 feet of snow just to escape the isolation. Maybe, Clara agreed. Or maybe I'd be too busy helping you update that weather journal and planning lessons for the mountain children to notice the isolation. The mention of teaching brought a new light to Clara's eyes, and Bear found himself imagining what it would be like to have her remain permanently. No more silent dinners eaten alone, no more conversations with only his own thoughts for company. Clara could bring life to this mountain sanctuary in ways he'd never dared hope for. There are families scattered through these hills, he said slowly. The Hendersons have 3 young ones who've never seen the inside of a schoolroom. The Peterson kids are bright, but running wild with no education to speak of. I could start small, Clara said eagerly. Basic reading and arithmetic, maybe some geography and natural sciences. Use your weather observations as part of the curriculum. Bear smiled at her enthusiasm, remembering suddenly why he'd been drawn to teaching himself in his younger days. There was something infectious about Clara's passion for education, her belief that knowledge could improve people's lives. You'd need supplies, he said, books, paper, slates. We could make a trip to Boulder in the spring, pick up what you'd need. We? Clara's heart leaped at the casual assumption of partnership in the word. If you're planning to stay, you'll need someone to watch your back. This country's still dangerous for a woman alone. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in his voice. You'd really want me to stay, even after all this trouble passes? Bear reached across the table and took her hand in his, feeling the calluses she'd developed from helping with daily chores. Clara, I've been alone on this mountain for 3 years. I thought I preferred it that way, but having you here, it's made me remember what I've been missing. What's that? Purpose beyond just surviving. Someone to share the good moments with. Someone whose opinion matters when I'm making decisions. Bear's thumb traced across her knuckles. Someone to care about. Clara turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. I care about you too. More than I probably should, considering how recently we met. Time moves differently when you're fighting for your life, Bear observed. A few days of real danger can teach you more about someone's character than months of normal acquaintance. And what has it taught you about mine? Bear studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the courage that had carried her through trials that would have broken weaker people. That you're exactly the kind of woman worth fighting for, worth changing my whole life for, if necessary. Clara felt her breath catch at the intensity in his voice. Bear! I know it's soon, he interrupted. I know we're still in danger, and there's no guarantee either of us will survive what's coming. But I need you to know how I feel before a sharp crack from outside cut off his words, followed by another sound they both recognized immediately, the deliberate snap of a branch under human feet. Bear was on his feet instantly, rifle in, hand gesturing for Clara to move away from the windows. How many? Clara whispered, drawing her derringer. Bear listened intently, sorting the sounds carried on the night wind. 3, maybe 4. Moving careful, trying to stay quiet. His jaw tightened grimly. Looks like our time just ran out. Clara felt her heart hammering as she took position behind the heavy wooden table, using it as cover while keeping her weapon ready. The intimacy of moments before was replaced by deadly focus as they prepared to fight for their lives. Outside, the clear mountain night that had seemed so peaceful suddenly felt full of threats. Whatever was approaching the cabin moved with the practiced stealth of experienced killers, and Clara knew their peaceful domestic interlude was about to end in violence. But as she watched Bear check his weapons with calm professionalism, she realized something important had changed between them. They were no longer a reluctant protector and desperate refugee. They were partners now, facing danger together with trust and determination forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The battle for their lives was about to begin. But Clara no longer faced it alone. The sounds outside faded into silence, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Bear held perfectly still, every sense straining to detect movement in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Beside him, Clara crouched behind the overturned table, her derringer steady in both hands. Minutes passed like hours before Bear relaxed slightly. "False alarm," he murmured. "Probably just deer moving through." But the incident served as a stark reminder of their vulnerability. As they righted the furniture and tried to settle back into their evening routine, both were acutely aware that their peaceful interlude was borrowed time. "We can't stay here much longer," Bear said as they prepared for sleep. "Once the weather clears completely, Canny will start searching again. This cabin's too isolated to defend against a determined assault." Clara nodded, though the thought of leaving their sanctuary filled her with dread. "Where would we go? There are places in the high country. Caves, abandoned mining camps, spots where we could see them coming from miles away." Bear checked the rifle one final time before setting it within easy reach. "But first, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." "What do you mean?" Bear studied her face in the firelight, seeing the exhaustion and strain she tried so hard to hide. "Those documents you saw Kane kill for, you know more about them than you've told me." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her bodice, where the marshal's portfolio remained hidden. She'd carried that secret for so long that revealing it felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. "I don't just know about the documents," she admitted quietly. "I have them." Bear went completely still. "You what?" "Marshal Henderson pressed them into my hands as he was dying, told me to get them to Denver, to someone he could trust." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been carrying them ever since." The silence that followed was deafening. Bear stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, processing this revelation and its implications. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Show me." With trembling fingers, Clara unbuttoned her dress enough to reveal the leather portfolio, secured against her ribs with strips of fabric. Bear watched as she carefully extracted the documents, noting how she'd protected them from the elements with the same care she might give a sacred relic. The papers were official territorial correspondence, bearing federal seals and signatures. Bear spread them on the table, reading by firelight with growing amazement and anger. What he saw there explained everything and made their situation infinitely more dangerous. "My God," he breathed. "Do you know what these are?" Clara shook her head, having never dared to examine the contents that had cost Marshal Henderson his life. "Evidence," Bear said grimly. "Proof that Territorial Governor Williams has been selling federal land grants to railroad interests for personal profit, and that he's been using outlaws like Kane to eliminate anyone who might expose the scheme." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. The marshal was investigating corruption at the highest levels of government. More than investigating, he was building a case. These documents named dates, amounts, witnesses, everything needed to bring down the governor and half the territorial legislature. Bear looked up at her with new respect and concern. "Clara, you're not just a witness to murder anymore. You're carrying evidence that could topple the entire territorial government." Clara sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd been carrying. "No wonder they're so determined to kill me. This isn't about eliminating a witness. It's about protecting a conspiracy worth millions of dollars." "Which means Kane isn't working alone," Bear continued, his military mind analyzing the tactical situation. "He'll have resources, backup, maybe even official support from corrupt lawmen." He paused, studying a particular document. "And according to this, the conspiracy includes people I used to trust." "What do you mean?" Bear's face was grim as he pointed to a signature on one of the papers. "Colonel Harrison, my former commanding officer, the man who court-martialed me for refusing to follow an illegal order." His laugh was bitter. "Turns out that illegal order was probably connected to this land scheme. I was getting too close to something that could have exposed the whole operation." Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "They destroyed your career to protect their conspiracy. And now they're trying to kill you for the same reason." Bear gathered the documents carefully, his mind racing through possibilities. "We can't just run from this, Clara. As long as these papers exist, they'll never stop hunting you. And as long as the conspiracy remains hidden, innocent people will keep suffering." "What are you suggesting?" Bear met her eyes directly. "We take the fight to them. Use these documents to expose the truth and bring down everyone involved." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "That's suicide. We're two people against an entire corrupt government network. They have resources, connections, armed men." "They have corruption and fear," Bear interrupted. "We have the truth. And sometimes, if you're smart about how you use it, truth is more powerful than all their advantages combined." Clara studied his face, seeing the determination that had once made him a decorated war hero. "You really think we could win?" "I think we have to try, because running will only delay the inevitable. They'll find us eventually, and when they do, you'll die, and these documents will disappear forever." Bear's voice grew fierce with conviction. "But if we act first, if we get this evidence to the right people before they can stop us..." "What right people? If the corruption goes as high as you think, who can we trust?" Bear smiled grimly. "I know someone. A newspaper editor in Denver named Samuel Morrison. He's one of the few honest men left in the territory, and he's been investigating territorial corruption for months. If we can get these documents to him..." A sharp crack outside the cabin cut off his words. This time, there was no mistaking the sound. A boot stepping on a broken branch, followed by the soft whinny of horses being held in check. Bear was moving before the sound faded, extinguishing the oil lamp and plunging the cabin into darkness. "They're here," he whispered, grabbing his rifle. "Stay low and move to the back corner. If I go down, you run for the high caves and don't look back." Clara clutched the precious documents to her chest, terror and determination warring in her. "Hart, I'm not leaving you, Clara. No." Her voice was fierce with resolve. "We're in this together now. Whatever happens, we face it as partners." Before Bear could argue, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the cabin walls, cold, confident, and utterly ruthless. "Bear McAllister." We know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to us. Send out the woman, and we might let you live." Clara recognized the voice immediately. Jebediah Kane had finally tracked them down. Bear positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, his mind calculating angles and distances. "How many men you got out there, Kane?" "Enough." Kane's voice carried the casual menace of a man who held all the advantages. "But I'm feeling generous tonight. Hand over Clara Whitmore and those papers she's carrying, and you can go back to your hermit life. Refuse, and we'll burn you out." "Counter-offer," Bear called back. "You and your boys ride away now, and I won't kill all of you before morning." Kane's laughter echoed off the surrounding peaks. "You always were too proud for your own good, Bear. That's what got you cashiered from the army, and it's what's going to get you killed tonight." Clara felt her blood run cold at the familiarity in Kane's voice. "You know him. We've met," Bear said grimly. "He was involved in the incident that ended my military career. Should have known he'd be part of this conspiracy." The knowledge that their enemies had planned this confrontation for years added a new layer of dread to their situation. This wasn't just about silencing a witness. It was about settling old scores and tying up loose ends that stretched back to Bear's disgrace. "What's it going to be, Bear?" Kane called. "Easy way or hard way?" Bear glanced at Clara, seeing courage and determination in her eyes, despite the terror she must be feeling. In that moment, he made a decision that would change both their lives. "And forever, Clara," he said quietly. "Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I was afraid." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." Bear leaned over and kissed her fiercely, pouring all his feelings into that brief contact. When they broke apart, his eyes were hard with lethal resolve. Hard. "Way it is, Kane," he shouted toward the darkness. "Come and take them." The silence that followed was pregnant with deadly possibility. Clara gripped her derringer and pressed her back against the wall, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived to see another dawn. Outside, Jebediah Kane smiled coldly and gestured to his men. The final confrontation was about to begin, and he intended to end it with blood and fire. But inside the cabin, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances prepared to fight for something more precious than their own lives. They were fighting for justice, for truth, and for the chance to build a future together. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets splintering the cabin's thick walls as Kane's men tried to pin them down. Bear returned fire methodically, his military training evident in the way he conserved ammunition and chose his targets. "Stay down!" he commanded Clara as a bullet shattered the window above her head. Glass rained down like deadly snow, and she pressed herself closer to the floor while clutching the precious documents. But something was wrong with the attack pattern. Bear had expected Kane to use fire arrows or torches to force them out, but the outlaws seemed content to exchange gunfire from protected positions. It was almost as if they were buying time rather than trying to end the siege quickly. "They're not trying to kill us," Bear realized with growing alarm. "They're keeping us pinned," while the sound of boots on the roof answered his unfinished question. Someone was moving across the cabin's thick log construction with careful, practiced steps. Bear cursed himself for not anticipating the obvious tactical move. While his attention was focused on the men in the trees, others had circled around to attack from above. "The chimney," Clara whispered. Understanding immediately, Bear nodded, grimly. In minutes, their attackers would drop something down the flue, probably burning brands or gunpowder, turning their sanctuary into a death trap. He had to act fast, or watch Clara burn alive. "When I say run, you head for that back window and don't stop until you reach the tree line," he ordered, checking his weapons one final time. "I'll hold them as long as I can. I'm not leaving." "You are." Bear's voice carried absolute authority. "Those documents are the only thing that can bring justice for Marshal Henderson and everyone else these bastards have killed. You have to survive, to tell the story. Before Clara could argue further, Bear made his move. He kicked open the front door and charged into the night, his war cry echoing off the mountain peaks as he laid down covering fire. The sudden assault caught Kane's men off guard, and several dove for cover as Bear's rifle found its targets with deadly accuracy. Clara ran for the back window as ordered, but instead of fleeing, she crouched in the shadows and watched Bear fight with the skill and fury of a man with nothing left to lose. He moved like a ghost through the darkness, using terrain and confusion to even the odds against superior numbers. That's when she saw the figure creeping toward Bear from behind, a knife gleaming in starlight, death approaching on silent feet. Without thinking, Clara raised her derringer and fired, the small pistol's report sharp in the night air. The would-be assassin stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder. Bear spun toward the sound, and their eyes met across the chaotic battlefield. In that moment, Clara saw something change in his expression. Surprise, gratitude, and a fierce pride that made her heart soar despite their desperate circumstances. "Nice shot," he called to her. "I told you I could hit what I aimed at," Clara replied, reloading with hands that barely trembled. Their brief exchange was interrupted by Kane's voice, commanding and furious. "Enough! You want to do this the hard way, Bear. Fine. But first let me tell you exactly who you're really fighting." Bear froze as a figure stepped into the clearing. Not one of Kane's outlaws, but a man in a pristine army uniform bearing the insignia of a full colonel. Even in the dim light, Bear recognized the face that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. "Hello, Captain McAllister," Colonel Harrison said with cold formality. Or should I say, disgraced ex-Captain McAllister. Clara felt Bear's shock, like a physical blow. This wasn't just about corrupt territorial officials. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the federal military. The man who had destroyed Bear's career was here personally to finish what he'd started. "Harrison," Bear's voice was deadly quiet. "I should have known you'd be involved in this." "Involved?" Harrison laughed. "Son, I've been running this operation since before you were old enough to hold a rifle. That land scheme you stumbled onto was just one piece of a much larger puzzle." The colonel gestured and more men emerged from the shadows. Not outlaws, but soldiers in unmarked uniforms. Clara counted at least a dozen, all armed and positioned with military precision. Whatever they'd stumbled into was far bigger than territorial corruption. The railroad contracts, the territorial appointments, the federal land grants, all of it serves a larger purpose. Harrison continued conversationally. "We're building an empire out here, Bear. A new kind of order that serves America's true interests instead of the bleeding heart nonsense they peddle back in Washington." Bear's mind raced as pieces of a vast conspiracy fell into place. "You're talking about secession, another rebellion. I'm talking about manifest destiny fulfilled by men with the vision to see it through." Harrison's voice carried the fervor of a true believer. "The federal government is weak, corrupted by politics and compromise, but out here in the territories we can build something pure, something strong." Clara felt sick as she understood the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about personal profit. It was about using the Western territories as a base for a new confederacy, one built on military might and corporate power instead of democratic ideals. "Marshal Henderson found out about your little rebellion," Bear said. "That's why you had him killed." "Henderson was a fool who couldn't see the bigger picture," Harrison replied dismissively. "Like you, he put abstract principles above practical necessities. That kind of thinking is exactly what's weakening America. And the massacre, I refused to participate in? The one that got me court-martialed?" Harrison smiled coldly. "A test of loyalty. We needed to know which officers would follow orders without question when the time came to act. You failed that test spectacularly," Bear felt. 3 years of shame and self-doubt crystallize into pure, focused rage. He'd been right to refuse that illegal order, right to speak out against the slaughter of innocents. His conscience had been clear, but his superiors had painted him as a coward to hide their own treasonous ambitions. "You destroyed my life to protect your conspiracy," he said. "I saved your life," Harrison corrected. "A court-martial was better than a bullet in the back, which is what usually happens to officers who know too much and can't be trusted." The colonel's expression hardened. "But tonight, that debt comes due." Clara clutched the documents tighter, understanding now why they were worth killing for. The evidence she carried could expose not just territorial corruption, but a full-scale plot against the federal government. The conspirators would stop at nothing to prevent that exposure. "Last chance, Bear," Harrison called. "Join us willingly, and we'll find a place for your skills in the new order. Refuse, and you'll die with the woman and those damning papers." Bear looked back at Clara, seeing courage and determination in her eyes, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. In that moment, he made a choice that had been 3 years in the making. "I'd rather die with my honor intact than live as a traitor," he declared. Harrison's face twisted with disappointment and rage. "So be it. You always were too stubborn for your own good." The colonel raised his hand to signal the final assault. But before he could give the order, a new voice cut through the night air, clear, authoritative, and utterly unexpected. "Federal marshals, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Harrison spun in disbelief as lanterns blazed to life throughout the forest, revealing dozens of armed men in federal uniforms. At their head stood a figure Bear recognized with amazement: Marshal William Thompson, Henderson's former partner and one of the few completely honest lawmen in the territory. "Thompson!" Bear called out in amazement. "How did you find you?" Thompson stepped into the clearing, his rifle trained on Colonel Harrison. "We've been tracking this conspiracy for months, ever since Henderson reported his suspicions before he was killed. When we lost contact with him, we knew they'd made their move." Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she realized they weren't alone anymore. But Harrison wasn't finished yet. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," the colonel said coldly. "These are territorial matters, outside federal jurisdiction. My men are operating under proper authority." "Whose authority?" Thompson demanded. "Because according to these federal warrants, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of a federal officer." Harrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Bear was faster. His rifle cracked once, and the treacherous colonel fell backward into the snow, clutching his shoulder. "That's for 3 years of thinking I was a coward," Bear said grimly. The rest of the confrontation was anticlimactic. Faced with superior numbers and federal authority, Kane's men and Harrison's soldiers surrendered without further violence. As the prisoners were secured and the wounded tended, Marshal Thompson approached Bear and Clara with expressions of gratitude and respect. "Miss Whitmore," Thompson said formally, "the federal government owes you a tremendous debt. Your courage in preserving Marshal Henderson's evidence has exposed a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of American democracy." Clara handed over the precious documents with hands that shook only slightly. "I just did what I thought was right." "And you, Captain McAllister," Thompson continued, turning to Bear, "your court-martial has been reviewed and overturned. The charges against you were fabricated to protect this conspiracy. Your military record is restored with full honors and back pay." Bear absorbed this vindication of everything he'd believed about himself, but found that it mattered less than he'd expected. "I appreciate that, Marshal, but I'm not sure I want to return to military service." Thompson smiled knowingly. "I didn't think you would, but the offer stands if you change your mind." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Clara found herself in Bear's arms, watching their enemies being led away in chains. The nightmare that had begun with witnessing a murder was finally over. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Bear looked down at her, seeing not the desperate refugee who'd collapsed in his yard, but the strong, courageous woman who'd helped him find his way back to honor and purpose. "Now we build that future we talked about. Together," Clara smiled, feeling truly safe for the first time in weeks. I'd like that very much. But even as they held each other in the growing light, both knew that their real journey was just beginning. They had love, they had justice, and they had each other. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the cabin, Bear and Clara stood on the porch of a small house in Denver, watching the morning sun illuminate the bustling streets below. The federal trials had concluded with convictions for all the conspirators, and the territorial government had been thoroughly cleaned of corruption. Marshal Thompson had personally thanked them both for their courage in exposing the plot, but victory had come with its own complications. "The newspaper wants to interview you again," Clara said, holding up a letter from the Denver Post. "Something about the schoolteacher who saved democracy." Bear smiled wryly. "And I suppose they want to talk to the hero of Hidden Valley as well." "Probably." Clara moved to stand beside him, enjoying the warmth of his presence. "Do you mind all the attention?" "I mind being called a hero when all I did was protect the woman I love," Bear replied honestly. "But if the story helps people understand what really happened, I suppose it's worth the discomfort." They'd been staying in Denver while giving testimony and helping federal investigators untangle the full scope of the conspiracy. The comfortable boarding house room was a far cry from Bear's mountain cabin, but they'd made it feel like home through the simple expedient of being together. Clara studied Bear's profile, noting the changes 3 weeks of civilization had wrought. In him, he'd trimmed his beard and hair, traded his buckskins for proper town clothes, and gradually relaxed the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in the wilderness. But the essential strength and integrity that had first attracted her remained unchanged. "Marshal Thompson offered you that position again yesterday," she said carefully. "Chief Federal Investigator for the Western Territories. It's good work. Important work." Bear nodded thoughtfully. Thompson had been persistent in his recruitment efforts, recognizing that Bear's combination of military training and intimate knowledge of the frontier made him invaluable for rooting out remaining corruption. "It would mean traveling constantly," Bear said. "Months away from home, dangerous assignments, no guarantee of regular correspondence." He turned to face Clara directly. "It would also mean leaving you behind more often than I'd like." Clara took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses that marked him as a man who'd lived by his own efforts. "Or it could mean we travel together. I've been thinking about my own future, and I've realized something important." "What's that?" "Teaching children in established schools is worthwhile, but there's greater need in the places where no schools exist yet. The frontier settlements, the mining camps, the ranching communities, those are where education can make the biggest difference." Bear felt his heart lift at the possibility she was suggesting. "You'd want to live that kind of life? Constantly moving, no permanent home, teaching wherever there's need?" "With you, yes." Clara's voice was firm with conviction. "We could be partners in every sense. You investigating corruption and bringing justice, me bringing education and opportunity. Together we could help build the kind of West that Marshall Henderson died believing in." The idea appealed to Bear more than he cared to admit. After years of isolation, the thought of having a mission beyond mere survival felt like awakening from a long dream. And doing that work alongside Clara would give his life a meaning he'd never imagined possible. "There's something I need to show you first," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Something I've been carrying for 3 years, too ashamed to look at." Clara watched as he carefully unwrapped a small object in oilcloth, a military medal bearing the ribbon and star of the Congressional Medal of Honor. The brass gleamed despite its age, and she could see the inscription honoring Captain Thorne. "McAllister for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. You never told me about this," she said softly, awed by the significance of what he'd accomplished. "I was convinced it didn't matter anymore," Bear admitted. "The men who gave it to me later branded me a coward and a traitor. I thought it was just another lie, another deception to serve their purposes. But now," Bear looked at the medal with new eyes, seeing not a reminder of past shame, but evidence of the courage and integrity that had always defined him. Now I understand that the medal represents what I've always been, regardless of what corrupt officers tried to make me believe about myself. Clara traced the inscription with one finger, reading the formal language that could never fully capture the reality of what Bear had endured. Tell me about it. The real story, not what's written here. Bear was quiet for a moment, gathering memories he'd tried for years to suppress. We were scouting behind Confederate lines. My unit and I came across a Union patrol that had been ambushed, wounded men scattered across a valley with enemy forces closing in from 3 sides. You went after them. Military doctrine said to withdraw and report the contact, Bear continued, but there were 17 wounded men down there, some of them barely old enough to shave. I couldn't just leave them to die. Clara could picture it clearly, a younger Bear making the choice between safety and conscience, choosing to risk everything for strangers who needed help. So you disobeyed orders? I told my men to pull back and get word to headquarters while I went down to help the wounded. Spent 6 hours under enemy fire, dragging men to safety one at a time. Got most of them out before Confederate reinforcements arrived. Most of them? Bear's voice grew heavy with old pain. Lost 3. Good men who might have lived if I'd been faster, smarter, more careful with my tactical choices. Clara squeezed his hands, understanding the guilt he'd carried for so long. You saved 14 lives, Bear. 14 men who went home to their families because you were willing to risk everything for them. That's what the medal citation says, but the men I couldn't save, their faces haunted my dreams for years. Bear looked at Clara with eyes that held old sorrow. Until I met you, I'd forgotten that sometimes saving what you can is enough, even when you can't save everything. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet pain in his voice. This man had spent years punishing himself for not being perfect, for not saving every life he'd tried to protect. The corrupt officers who'd destroyed. His career had known exactly how to exploit that self-doubt. The massacre you refused to participate in, she said gently. Was it connected to this? Bear nodded grimly. 3 years later, Harrison was my commanding officer during the Indian campaigns. He ordered my unit to attack a peaceful village. Women, children, old men who'd never raised a weapon against anyone. When I refused and spoke out against the order, he used my history of insubordination to justify the court-martial. He twisted your greatest strength into apparent weakness, made me doubt everything I'd ever believed about duty and honor. Bear's jaw tightened with remembered pain. For 3 years, I convinced myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a fool who put sentiment above military necessity. Clara studied his face, seeing the man who'd saved her life, who'd risked everything to protect her and fight for justice. And now I know that the capacity to care about innocent lives isn't weakness. It's what separates good soldiers from mere killers. Bear rewrapped the medal carefully, but instead of putting it away, he kept it in his hands. I'm ready to wear this again, ready to remember what it represents. Clara smiled, seeing the healing that had taken place in Bear's heart over the past weeks. I'm proud of you, proud to love a man with that kind of courage. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Denver come alive around them. The city was growing rapidly, with new buildings rising daily and streams of settlers heading west toward opportunity and adventure. But Clara found herself thinking about the quiet mountains, where their love had been born. Do you miss it? She asked. The cabin, the solitude, the simple life? Parts of it, Bear admitted. The peace, the connection to the land, the feeling of being completely self-sufficient. He paused, considering. But I don't miss the loneliness, and I've realized that running away from the world's problems doesn't solve them. It just leaves other people to deal with the consequences. So we accept Marshal Thompson's offer? Bear turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Are you sure, Clara? It won't be an easy life. We'll face danger regularly, deal with the worst elements of frontier society, spend long periods in primitive conditions. "I've already faced all of that," Clara replied with quiet confidence. "And I've discovered that I'm stronger than I ever knew. Besides," she added with a smile, "I'll have the best possible partner watching my back." Bear felt his heart expand with love and gratitude for this remarkable woman. "When you collapsed in my yard 3 weeks ago, I thought you were just another burden I'd have to deal with. And now I know you're the best thing that ever happened to me." Bear reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small object, wrapped in soft leather. "Which brings me to something I've been meaning to ask you." Clara's breath caught as he unwrapped a simple ring carved from mountain laurel, its surface polished to a warm glow. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone who'd spent countless hours perfecting every detail. "I made this during the long evenings while you were recovering," Bear said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I know it's not gold or silver, but—" "It's perfect," Clara interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "It's absolutely perfect." Bear took her left hand in his, feeling how naturally their fingers intertwined. "Clara Whitmore, you saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with bullets or outlaws. You reminded me who I am beneath all the pain and doubt. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Clara whispered, then repeated it more strongly. "Yes, absolutely yes." Bear slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there. The wood was warm against her skin, a living symbol of their love and the natural world where it had grown. "Should we make it official before we head back into the wilderness?" Bear asked. "I'd like to call you my wife when I introduce you to Marshal Thompson's people." Clara laughed through her tears. "I'd like that too, though I should warn you, I'm keeping my name professionally. Clara Whitmore the teacher, Clara McAllister the wife. I wouldn't expect anything else from the woman who faced down Jebediah Kane with nothing but a derringer and pure courage." They kissed then, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against Bear's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Next week, if you're ready. Thompson has reports of suspicious activity near the Colorado-Utah border. Possible land fraud, intimidation of homesteaders, the kind of work that requires both investigation and education." Clara smiled, already imagining the challenges and opportunities that awaited them. "I'll start gathering teaching supplies. Slates, primers, arithmetic books, the basics needed to start schools wherever we settle. And I'll requisition proper equipment for extended field work. Weapons, camping gear, communication equipment." Bear paused, struck by a sudden thought. "We'll need a wagon if you're bringing teaching supplies." "A covered wagon," Clara agreed. "Mobile enough for travel, secure enough to protect books and papers from weather." She looked up at him with sparkling eyes. "Our own little schoolhouse on wheels." Bear chuckled at her enthusiasm, remembering how that same passion for education had first impressed him. "You realize we'll be living like nomads for months at a time." "I realize we'll be building something important together," Clara corrected. "Bringing law and learning to places that need both desperately. What could be more worthwhile than that?" As they stood together planning their future, neither noticed the figure watching them from across the street. A man in expensive clothes, with cold, intelligent eyes. Someone who'd managed to avoid arrest when the conspiracy was exposed, but hadn't forgotten the people responsible for his associate's downfall. Some vendettas, he reflected grimly, were worth waiting for the right opportunity to settle. But Bear and Clara were too absorbed in their happiness to sense the danger still lurking in the shadows. They had love, they had purpose, and they had each other. For the moment, that seemed like enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The greatest test of their partnership was still to come. 2 months later, Bear and Clara made camp in a grove of aspens near the Colorado-Utah border, their covered wagon positioned to serve as both home and mobile schoolhouse. The past weeks had been everything they'd hoped for. Bear had uncovered evidence of illegal land seizures, while Clara had established temporary schools in 3 different mining settlements. But this morning felt different. Bear's instincts, honed by years of frontier survival, whispered warnings that he couldn't quite define. "Something's not right," he said, checking his weapons for the third time since dawn. Clara looked up from the lesson plans she was preparing for the children in nearby Millfield. "What kind of not right?" "Too quiet. No bird calls, no small animal movement. The horses are nervous." Bear gestured toward their team, which stood with ears pricked and eyes alert, scanning the surrounding forest. "Either there's a predator nearby or people who don't want to be seen," Clara finished, understanding immediately. She closed her lesson book and moved to where her own weapons were stored. "How many?" Bear studied the tree line with practiced eyes, noting subtle signs that would be invisible to most observers. A broken branch here, disturbed earth there, the faint scent of tobacco smoke carried on the morning breeze. "At least 4, probably more. They've been watching us since yesterday, moving parallel to our route." His jaw tightened grimly. "Professional work. These aren't random bandits." Clara felt her blood chill as she recognized the implications. Someone from the conspiracy, but they're all dead or in prison. Not all of them. Harrison and Kane were the muscle, but conspiracies like that always have financial backers who stay in the shadows. Bear's hand moved to the tomahawk on his belt, the weapon he'd carried since his scouting days. "Looks like we missed someone important." Before Clara could respond, a voice called out from the forest, cultured, educated, and utterly without warmth. "Mr. and Mrs. McAllister, please don't reach for your weapons. You're surrounded by men with rifles, and any sudden movement will end very badly for both of you." Bear cursed silently as armed figures emerged from concealment around their camp. 6 men, all dressed like respectable businessmen, but carrying military-grade weapons with professional competence. At their head walked a distinguished gentleman, in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothes that spoke of substantial wealth. "Cornelius Blackwood," Bear said grimly, recognizing the man from wanted posters. "I should have known you'd surface eventually." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Captain McAllister, or do you prefer federal investigator now? I must say your rehabilitation has been quite remarkable. From disgraced exile to national hero in just a few months." Clara studied Blackwood with the analytical eye of someone trained to read character. Everything about him spoke of power and ruthless intelligence, the kind of man who moved pieces on a board while others paid the price for his ambitions. "You were the money behind the conspiracy," she said. "The one who financed Harrison and Kane." "Among other investments," Blackwood agreed pleasantly. "I've always believed in diversifying my portfolio. Railroad interests, mining claims, territorial, politics, all profitable ventures when properly managed. Until we exposed your operation and sent your partners to prison," Bear replied. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew colder. "A temporary setback. Cornelius Blackwood didn't build an empire by giving up when faced with minor obstacles." "Minor obstacles?" Clara couldn't hide her outrage. "You had federal marshals murdered. You planned to overthrow territorial governments." "I planned to bring order and prosperity to a chaotic region," Blackwood corrected. "The deaths were regrettable but necessary. And as for territorial governments, have you seen the incompetence and corruption that passes for leadership out here? My organization would have been a vast improvement." Bear felt the familiar cold rage that had sustained him through years of combat. "Your organization murdered innocent people to protect your profits. My organization created jobs, built infrastructure, and brought civilization to the wilderness. A few deaths are acceptable casualties when weighed against the greater good." Blackwood gestured dismissively. "But we're not here to debate philosophy. We're here to settle accounts." Clara's hand moved instinctively toward her concealed derringer, but stopped when several rifle barrels swung in her direction. The men surrounding them were clearly professionals, alert for any sign of resistance. "What do you want?" she asked. "Justice," Blackwood replied. "My associates are dead or imprisoned because of your interference. My carefully constructed network has been destroyed. Millions of dollars in investments have been lost. His voice grew harder with each word. Such actions require consequences. Bear studied their captors' positions, calculating angles and distances with the tactical mind of a veteran soldier. 6 men, well-armed and positioned with military precision, no easy escape routes, no obvious weaknesses in their deployment. But he'd faced worse odds before. "Let Clara go," he said quietly. "Your quarrel is with me." Blackwood laughed. "On the contrary, Captain, Mrs. McAllister is equally responsible for my current difficulties. Besides, she carries knowledge that could still prove problematic if she were allowed to share it with the wrong people." Clara felt fear and anger warring in her chest. "I've already testified at the trials. I've told federal investigators everything I know. About Harrison and Kane, yes, but not about me, because you didn't know I existed until now." Blackwood's smile was predatory. "However, now that you've seen my face and heard my voice, you represent a continuing threat to my remaining operations." Bear's mind raced through possibilities, seeking any advantage that might tip the odds in their favor. The tomahawk at his belt was a close-quarters weapon, useless against multiple opponents with rifles. Clara's derringer was a single shot, probably not enough to change the tactical situation, but there was one factor Blackwood might not have considered. "You made a mistake coming after us personally," Bear said. "Men like you usually stay hidden while others do the dangerous work." "Perhaps, but some matters require personal attention." Blackwood checked an expensive pocket watch. "Which brings us to the method of your demise. I considered simply having you shot, but that seemed insufficiently educational." The businessman gestured to his men, who began moving with practiced efficiency. 2 of them approached the wagon, while others maintained their threatening positions around Bear and Clara. "You see, I want your deaths to send a message to anyone else who might consider interfering with my interests." Blackwood continued conversationally. "A mysterious fire that consumes a federal investigator and his schoolteacher wife will be much more memorable than simple bullets." Clara watched in horror as Blackwood's men began dousing their wagon with lamp oil. Her teaching supplies, Bear's equipment, all their carefully gathered possessions, everything they'd built together was about to go up in flames. "Along with their lives." "You're insane," she said. "I'm thorough," Blackwood corrected. "Dead martyrs are quickly forgotten, but people who die in ways that suggest divine displeasure tend to discourage imitators." Bear saw the oil spreading around their campsite and knew they had minutes at most before the situation became hopeless. When the fire started, Blackwood's men would either shoot them if they tried to escape or let them burn if they stayed put. "Time for desperate measures, Clara," he said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle message she'd learned to read during their months together. "Remember what I taught you about creating distractions?" Clara's eyes flicked to Bear's face, seeing the resolve there. Whatever he was planning would require split-second timing and absolute trust. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Now!" Bear shouted, hurling his tomahawk with deadly precision at the nearest gunman while diving toward Clara to cover her body with his own. The clearing erupted in chaos as Clara rolled toward their wagon's cover, drawing her derringer while Bear grappled with one of Blackwood's men for control of a rifle. Gunshots cracked through the morning air, and the scent of gunpowder mixed with lamp oil created an explosive atmosphere of danger. But Bear's surprise attack had accomplished its purpose. It had disrupted Blackwood's careful planning and created the kind of confused close quarters fighting where superior numbers mattered less than individual skill and determination. The real battle for their lives had finally begun. Bear's tomahawk found its mark with deadly precision, burying itself in the chest of Blackwood's nearest gunman. As the man fell, Bear rolled and came up with the fallen rifle, using the wagon as cover while bullets splintered the wood around. Clara had taken position behind a large boulder, her derringer ready, but her attention focused on the oil-soaked ground, where any spark could turn their campsite into an inferno. Blackwood's remaining men were repositioning, trying to maintain their tactical advantage while avoiding the spreading pool of lamp oil. "Persistent little rabbits," Blackwood observed coldly, taking cover behind a tree while his men continued their assault. "But this merely delays the inevitable." Bear fired carefully, conserving ammunition while forcing Blackwood's men to keep their heads down. But he could see their predicament clearly. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position that would become untenable the moment someone struck a match. That's when Clara spotted something that changed everything. Among her scattered teaching supplies was her leather-bound Bible, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. But more importantly, tucked between its pages were the letters of recommendation she'd carried from Denver, documents that bore federal seals and official signatures. "Bear," she called out, pointing toward the Bible. "The federal documents." Bear understood immediately. If they could signal their official status to any potential witnesses, it might bring help, or at least ensure that their deaths would be investigated by federal authorities instead of dismissed as an unfortunate accident. He made a lightning-fast decision that would have seemed suicidal to anyone who didn't know his military background. "Cover me," he shouted, then broke from cover in a diagonal run toward the scattered documents. Clara opened fire with her derringer, the small pistol's crack echoing through the clearing as she tried to keep Blackwood's men pinned down. Her shot went wide, but the muzzle flash and smoke created enough distraction for Bear to reach the Bible and snatch up the official papers. "Federal investigators," Bear bellowed at the top of his lungs, holding the documents high so their seals caught the morning sunlight. "We're federal investigators." His shout echoed off the surrounding hills, carrying far enough to reach anyone within a mile of their position. Blackwood's face darkened with rage as he realized the implications. "Silence him," the businessman commanded his men. "No witnesses!" But Bear's desperate gamble was already paying off. From the direction of Millfield came the sound of horses at full gallop, riders responding to the gunfire, and Bear's shouted identification. Clara felt her heart leap with hope as she recognized the possibilities. "Too late, Blackwood," she called out. "Help is coming." Blackwood's men began to waver, uncertain whether to continue the attack or retreat before they could be identified by approaching witnesses. Their hesitation gave Bear the opening he needed. With fluid grace born of years of frontier combat, he retrieved his tomahawk from the fallen gunman and charged the nearest position. The weapon flashed in deadly arcs as Bear closed to hand-to-hand range, where his superior skills and fury gave him overwhelming advantage. Clara watched in amazement as Bear fought with a lethal efficiency that was both terrifying and magnificent. This was the warrior who'd earned the Medal of Honor, the soldier who'd saved 14 men under impossible odds. Every movement was precise, economical, deadly. But even Bear couldn't fight 6 men simultaneously. A rifle butt caught him across, the shoulder spinning him around, and Clara saw blood spreading across his shirt. Without thinking, she abandoned her cover and ran toward him, her empty derringer raised like a club. "Get away from him!" she screamed, launching herself at Bear's attacker with all the fury of a woman defending the man she loved. The gunman, startled by her unexpected assault, stumbled backward, directly into the spreading pool of lamp oil. Clara's momentum carried them both down, and as they hit the ground hard, the man's rifle discharged into the air. The muzzle flash ignited the oil in a whoosh of flame that sent everyone diving for cover. Fire spread across the campsite with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. The wagon caught immediately, sending smoke and burning debris high into the morning sky, a signal visible for miles that would bring more help than Blackwood had bargained for. "Retreat!" Blackwood commanded, recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. "Fall back to the horses." But Bear wasn't about to let the man responsible for so much death and suffering escape justice. Despite his wounds, he pursued Blackwood through the smoke and flames, his tomahawk gleaming with deadly intent. "This ends here," Bear shouted, closing the distance between them with the relentless determination of a natural predator. Blackwood drew a silver-plated pistol, its expensive craftsmanship reflecting his wealth and arrogance. "Indeed it does, Captain, but not the way you planned." The two men faced each other across 10 feet of burning ground, the heat from the spreading fire making the air shimmer between them. Clara, having extracted herself from the unconscious gunman, watched with her heart in her throat as the final confrontation played out. "You killed Marshal Henderson," Bear said, advancing steadily despite the pistol trained on his chest. "You corrupted the territorial government and planned to overthrow federal authority. How many more people were you willing to murder for your profits?" "As many as necessary," Blackwood replied without a trace of remorse. "You frontier simpletons never understand that progress requires sacrifice. My vision would have brought order and prosperity to this chaotic region. Your vision was built on corruption and murder, and your righteousness will die with you in these flames," Blackwood snarled, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed across the burning campsite, but Bear had anticipated the move. Years of combat experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, the tightening of muscles, the shift in breathing, the momentary focus that came before action. He'd thrown himself sideways the instant before Blackwood fired, the bullet passing harmlessly through the space where he'd been standing. Bear's return throw was perfect, the tomahawk spinning end over end to bury itself in Blackwood's chest with the solid thunk of justice finally served. Cornelius. Blackwood fell backward into the flames he'd intended for others, his expensive clothes catching fire as his life ebbed away. The man who'd orchestrated so much death and suffering died among the burning remnants of Bear and Clara's peaceful camp. Clara ran to Bear's side as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Marshal Thompson and a squad of federal agents crested the nearby ridge, drawn by the smoke and flames, to investigate what appeared to be a major incident. "Are you hurt?" Clara asked anxiously, examining Bear's wounds with practiced efficiency. "Nothing that won't heal," Bear replied, pulling her close despite the smoke and heat. "How about you?" "Alive thanks to you." Clara looked around at the destruction of everything they'd built together. "We lost everything." "Not everything," Bear corrected, gesturing toward where Marshal Thompson was dismounting to survey the scene. "We stopped Blackwood. We proved our federal documents were real, and we're both still breathing. Everything else can be replaced." Clara smiled through her tears, recognizing the truth in his words. Their possessions were gone, but their love had survived the ultimate test. They'd faced death together and emerged stronger for the experience. "Besides," Bear added with a grin that reminded her of the dangerous mountain man who'd first saved her life, "I never did like that wagon anyway. Too civilized for my taste." Clara laughed despite everything, marveling at this man's ability to find humor even in the midst of catastrophe. "Next time we buy a better wagon." "Next time," Bear agreed, holding her close as federal agents secured the scene and began the process of documenting what had happened. The final battle was over, but their life together was just beginning. 6 months later, Bear and Clara stood on a familiar mountain peak, watching the sun set over the Colorado Territory. The view from their new cabin was even more spectacular than the one from Bear's old place, a sweeping vista of peaks and valleys that seemed to stretch forever toward the western horizon. But this cabin was different from the isolated refuge where Bear had once hidden from the world. This was a home built for partnership, with space for Clara's teaching materials and Bear's investigative work, with windows designed to welcome visitors rather than watch for enemies. The Henderson children did beautifully with their lessons. "Today," Clara said, settling beside Bear on the porch swing he'd built from mountain pine, "little Mary is already reading at a level that would impress children twice her age." Bear smiled, remembering the shy 8-year-old who'd hidden behind her mother's skirts when Clara first arrived to establish the mountain school. You've worked miracles with these kids. Half of them had never held a book before you got here. They were hungry for knowledge, Clara replied. That's all any teacher can ask for, students who want to learn. The past months had been everything they'd dreamed of and more. Bear's work with Marshall Thompson had helped clean up the remaining corruption in territorial government, while Clara's mountain school had become a model for frontier education. Children came from homesteads 50 miles away to attend her classes, and several other communities had requested similar programs. Speaking of students, Bear said, pulling a letter from his shirt pocket, we received another request today. A settlement near the Utah border wants to know if we'd consider establishing a school there next spring. Clara took the letter, reading it with growing excitement. They're offering to build a proper schoolhouse and living quarters. And look, they're specifically requesting both a teacher and a federal investigator. Our reputation is spreading. Are you interested? Clara considered the question seriously. The Utah settlement would mean new challenges, different students, the opportunity to build something meaningful in another frontier community. But it would also mean leaving this place where they'd found such happiness. What do you think? She asked. You're the one who gave up his hermit ways to build this life with me. Bear looked out over the mountains he'd called home for so many years, feeling the pull of new horizons. I think we've proven that home isn't a place, it's wherever we're together, and there are a lot of communities out there that could use what we have to offer. Clara smiled, recognizing the restless energy that had made Bear such an effective scout and investigator. The wandering life appeals to you. The purposeful life appeals to me, Bear corrected. And purpose means going where we're needed most. They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the peaks, each lost in thoughts of the future they were building together. The hardships and dangers they'd faced had forged a partnership stronger than either had thought possible. I have something for you, Clara said suddenly, reaching into her apron pocket. A wedding present, though I know we've been married for months now. She handed him a small wrapped object, watching his face as he carefully opened it. Inside was a compass, not the expensive military instrument he'd carried during the war, but a simple, reliable piece crafted by a local artisan. The inscription on the back read, "To my true north, forever, Clara." Bear felt his throat tighten with emotion as he traced the engraved words. Clara, this is a reminder that no matter how far we travel or how dangerous the work becomes, we'll always find our way back to each other. Clara finished softly. Bear pulled her close, marveling at how perfectly she understood him. I love you, Mrs. McAllister, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Mountain Man, even if you have gone somewhat civilized on me. Bear chuckled, running his fingers through hair that was now neatly trimmed, and a beard that no longer looked wild enough to frighten children. I prefer to think of it as domesticated by the right woman. Speaking of domestication, Clara said with studied casualness, there's something else we should discuss about our future plans. Something in her tone made Bear look at her more closely. There was a new light in her eyes, a barely contained excitement that suggested important news. What kind of something? He asked. Clara took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. The kind that will make our traveling days somewhat more complicated come spring. Bear stared at her in amazement as the implications sank in. We're going to be parents, Clara confirmed, tears of joy streaming down her face. I wanted to be sure before I told you, but Dr. Morrison confirmed it this morning when he came to check on the Peterson boy's broken arm. Bear swept her into his arms, spinning her around the porch with whoops of joy that echoed off the surrounding peaks. When he finally set her down, both were laughing and crying simultaneously. A baby, he said wonderfully. Our baby. Are you happy? Clara asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Bear replied, amazed, grateful, terrified, excited, all at the same time. He paused, struck by a sudden thought. This changes our plans for Utah. It changes our timeline, Clara agreed. But it doesn't change our purpose. If anything, it makes our work more important. We want to build a world where our child can grow up with opportunities and justice, don't we? Bear nodded, understanding that Clara was right. Their work bringing education and law enforcement to frontier communities wasn't just a career anymore. It was legacy building for the next generation. We'll modify our approach, he said thoughtfully. Establish more permanent bases, travel shorter distances, work with local communities to build sustainable programs instead of constantly moving. Exactly what I was thinking. And there's no reason we can't continue the work after the baby comes. Frontier children need to see examples of families working together to improve their communities. Bear placed his hand on Clara's stomach again, imagining the life growing within her. Thomas would have been excited about becoming an uncle. He would have spoiled this child terribly, Clara agreed with a sad smile. But I think he'd be proud of the life we've built. We're both doing work that matters, helping people, making a difference. And we found love in the most unlikely place imaginable. Clara leaned into Bear's embrace, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Sometimes I think about that night when I collapsed in your yard, begging you not to kill me. And I was so focused on staying alive that I never imagined I might find something worth living for. Clara looked up at Bear's face, seeing the strength and tenderness that had captured her heart. You saved my life. But more than that, you gave me a life worth saving. Bear kissed her forehead gently, tasting the salt of happy tears. You saved mine too, schoolteacher, in ways I'm still discovering. As they sat together on their mountain porch, surrounded by the vast wilderness that had brought them together, both reflected on the journey that had led them to this moment. They'd faced death, corruption, and their own deepest fears. They'd fought for justice and found love in the process. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and opportunities. There would be more communities to serve, more children to teach, more wrongs to right. And now there would be a child of their own to raise and protect. But whatever came next, they would face it together. The reformed mountain man and the schoolteacher, who'd found the courage to warm his bed and his heart. In a land where survival often meant choosing between principles and pragmatism, they discovered that the best choice was finding someone worth surviving for. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had watched over countless other couples who'd carved out love and hope in the unforgiving wilderness. Bear and Clara McAllister had become part of that timeless story, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the raw materials of courage, trust, and determination. As the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and possibility, they began planning for the life they would build together. A life dedicated to justice, education, and the family they were creating. A life that proved love could bloom anywhere, even in the harshest wilderness, when two hearts were brave enough to trust each other completely. Their story had begun with a desperate plea in the snow. Don't kill me, mountain man, I'll warm your bed. It had become something far more beautiful than either had dared imagine, a love that would warm their hearts for all the winters to come.